All right. So you may or may not have noticed I sent an email, and I think, a little confused when I sent it, that had a link to some videos from the summer from chapters 20 and 21, I think. So those may or may not be helpful for you with the questions. It seems like in the one of the videos, I did start off the video. I think it was the 21 video, talking about the causes of the Great Depression, but we'll talk about that a little today. And I really do think the best place for you to get detailed information is your textbook. That's, part of why I gave you the textbook or wanted you to get it. And that last probably 3 or 4 pages of chapter 20, I think will be really helpful in answering that question. So before we get started, let me see if you have other questions. So I put the links to the summer videos, and I think I made those public so that you could probably search the YouTube channel if you didn't see the link. And working on getting caught up on the most recent things that you've turned in, but I'm finally caught up on the old things you've turned in. All right. So questions, comments, concerns before we look at the notes. And then at the end of class, I'll go back and kind of check the roll one more time to see who all is here. So what questions do you have? All right, I will look at sharing the notes then. We'll get started on that. But anytime you have a question, please feel free to say it, type it in. Do I consider myself a tough grader? Oh gosh, I have no idea. That's an interesting question. I don't know. That makes me think that you might. Like specific examples are really what I'm looking for. So if you say, like, one of the causes of the Great Depression was stock market problems, tell me specifically what the stock market problems were. I know that there are some things that I read where people would make like a big general comment about the growth of something, but then not show an example of the growth. Or you would say that the Teller and Platt amendments put restrictions on the freedom of the new territories gained in the Spanish-American War, but you didn't tell me what the restrictions were. So what I'm really looking for is more of a specific explanation. And if you give good details, you're probably going to get 70, 80%. And then if you add why those details matter, like the so what part of the question, why does it matter? How does it impact the future? How did all those things fit together? The so what part probably gets you those last couple of points. So, and one of the things I noticed on some of the questions that I just graded, I know that in the weekly question, I probably put like 3 or 4 things I want you to talk about. Be sure you talk about all of them. So, yeah, yes, general response and then a for example. And it's funny because there were some papers that were really, really long, but still really general. And then there were other papers that were really short, but really specific, and then analyzed what they just talked about. So it's not even necessarily about length, although I know it's probably frustrating for those of you that wrote, fairly long answers and then didn't get all the points. It's not the goal. Also remember, a certain number of points possible for the class. So you need 90% of those points to get an A. And I think your point total is 300, so you need 270, I think it is, to get an A. So you've got 30 points that you can give up. And, excuse me, you also have the book review, which is 20 extra points. So to be honest with you, you kind of have 50 points to play with. So it's probably not as crucial. Like if you get an 8 instead of a 9 on a question, it's probably not the end of the world, although it may feel bad. You know what I'm saying? So, and you also are welcome to tell me like, hey, I think you should look at this one again, um, understanding that I may not get to that right away. And if you ask me to do that, and it doesn't seem like I did, feel free to ask again. So, but feel free to ask. And I'll try to put some comments, although the comments sometimes are a little general, but I'll try to put in, especially when I just had surgery on my shoulder, the comments, it's hard to type, but there should be some comments in there as well that maybe give you suggestions about other things you could have talked about. And you can also, if you want, send me an email, try to turn something in a little early and say like, here's what I'm thinking about saying. Would you add anything else? Now, don't do that every week with every question. And a few of you have done that, and I hope it's been helpful. And for your book review, you absolutely should do that if you want to. Okay, sorry, thirsty. All right, so 21, we don't want to talk about 21 yet, do we? All right, so last time in class, the other class, not you, sorry, talked about chapter 20. And what we noticed in the early part of chapter 20 is it's talking more about just general economic stuff and cultural stuff. So the culture's really varied in this decade. So you've got some pretty wild and crazy stuff going on for the era. You've got some pretty calm and sedate stuff going on. You've got some country versus city stuff going on. You've got some modern versus traditional stuff going on. You've got some religious stuff versus science stuff going on. And I don't know, I have an older brother who's a little quirky like me. And we were kind of talking back and forth about how it seems like you see the same themes in culture and politics repeat all the time. And like if you watched the debate last night, you know, you probably saw some similar themes, especially with, sorry for the yawn, there was discussion about Roe versus Wade, which neither of them would answer, or several questions which neither of them would answer. But, you know, are you more focused on religion? Are you more focused on science? And those debates are as old as, I mean, they're old. They're old. So, and you see that in the 20s with the Scopes trial, which I think is kind of interesting. All right. So I don't want to necessarily go over the whole chapter with you. However, maybe just a quick mention of the main things. We had issues with race during this time period. I know that we talked before about how progressive era wants to make progress and reform, excuse me, but the area where they're not as good about reform is race and ethnicity. And you maybe see a little carryover of that in this time period. You see this frustration with immigrants who won't assimilate, with Sacco and Vanzetti, in part because they're anarchists. They're foreigners who don't like the current form of government and want to make a pretty dramatic change to it. And anarchists, those are the folks that just kind of want to blow stuff up, destroy things. And they were not highly revered during that time period. Yeah, my brother and I were talking about how you kind of see a resurgence of anarchists as well in the modern era, potentially. I'm also recognizing not everybody who's demonstrating or protesting is an anarchist, but there's probably an odd percentage of them who are, and how their organizations differ. And it was true back then. They don't have an overall organization where they're nationally organized, but they have local contingents, because that's kind of how anarchists work. So, but Sacco and Vanzetti got convicted of murder, robbery and murder, with less than credible evidence, and they're able to show after their conviction that some of their evidence was forged, that witnesses were paid to testify against them, that the trial judge was prejudiced against them, but none of that mattered. So even though the evidence probably pointed to someone else, we still execute these two guys for murder. in part because of who they are politically. Nothing more important in this era of the 20s than the automobile, which also can help you answer the weekly question a little about the parts of the economy that were strong. The automobile part of the economy was very strong. However, if you're focused on consumer goods that are durable, so they don't have to be replaced that often, excuse me, if your economy is based on the production of those, if the product continues to last, then you don't have to replace it as often. You've got to convince somebody that they need a new car when they don't really need a new car. And then when you have Ford and General Motors and whoever else, you had Packard and whoever else made cars back then, I don't know. All of those people are competing for a limited market. Now, as long as people have money to buy stuff they don't need, you're in pretty good shape. And in the early part of the 20s, we had money to buy stuff we didn't need. And the things related to the automobile industry listed here, restaurants, roads, steel, rubber, glass, petroleum products, those things, those industries were doing pretty well during that era. But when the car market drops off, all of those are going to drop off as well. Other things, anything related to agriculture is kind of struggling during this time period, and that's not going to improve during this era. It'll eventually improve with some government assistance in the mid to late 1930s, but it's going to be a long time. Also, the government's goal is to work in concert with business and not to regulate them. So you're going to see a lack of regulation of not only business, but finance and banking, which is going to be a pretty big problem during this era. Okay. Other stuff, women are acting a little crazy during this time period. They're dressing different, less clothing, maybe less clothing and more rights, I don't know, possibly. But shorter skirts, so dancing is easier. They don't want to have the corsets and binding clothing, that kind of stuff. Shorter hair, that sort of thing. Most women remain fairly conservative during this time period, except maybe in the post I'm a child, pre I'm a mom era, when they're maybe going out and doing stuff. So the flapper culture, really more urban and middle class, upper middle class kind of thing. Not as different, not as obvious in the country, or not as prominent in the country. And you know, if you're poor, you don't participate in a lot of these things. So the ERA is proposed and rejected during this time period, and that'll happen 3 times. Business combination with government is pretty strong during this era, and the US colonial version of colonialism is really to control oil reserves overseas. So, and also limited freedom of speech during this time period if it seems politically dangerous, presents a clear and present danger, or if it is similar to yelling fire in a crowded theater. All right, religion during this time period, I know none of these things have to do with the weekly question. Religion is big in this era, even though there'll be some people who proclaim the death of religion in this era. You live in the middle of the country, so you know that's not true. Fundamentalism is big during this era, where you have a literal belief in the Bible and believe that that should guide all of your life principles. And sometimes people consider that a little harsh and judgmental. And people who were fundamentalist Protestant Christians tended to be the ones in favor of prohibition, and the ones who were not, there's going to be an argument between those groups. The Scopes monkey trial, which was about evolution, happens during this time period in Tennessee, And the book talks about that a little bit. Certainly, if you've already watched the video from last time, I don't want to go over the whole thing again, but it made the teaching of evolution illegal in the state of Tennessee. The goal in writing that law was just for the guy who wrote it to show that he was more spiritual than the other guys who didn't write it. There really wasn't a plan to enforce it. So the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, decided to enforce the enforcement and try to get the law overturned. So they actually recruit a guy who would be willing to teach evolution and get arrested so that they could get a lawyer for him and try to overturn the law, which it does get overturned, but mostly because he gets convicted and then sentenced by a jury, sentenced by a judge rather than a jury, so it gets overturned on a technicality, and the state of Tennessee doesn't ask for it to be re-prosecuted. But very public argument about the conflict between science and religion, which people thought was very strong during that era. I am not sure, I don't know if people still think it's as strong. I know, where we live, when we adopt new textbooks for either history or biology, that those public hearings at the State Board of Education, at Texas Education Agency, are the ones that are most well attended, and that there are people who, come out and argue about those things. And also, in local school districts, you see that kind of stuff from time to time. I sort of think I'm imposing opinion here, that most people see that science and religion can overlap and they can be compatible, but I may just be, off the deep end on that. During this era, people didn't necessarily think that, and I know that people don't always think that in the modern era either. The KKK was strangely big during this time period. They promoted themselves as being a very pro-American group, and they just wanted everybody to sort of fit in and claim their American heritage, which is, I know it's kind of a funny thought, and we don't see this quite the same way, although, I don't know, I shouldn't say that because we all see things a little differently, but, during this era, the big push was assimilation. So wherever you came from, leave that behind. Now you're in the United States, we have to embrace whatever is US culture and leave the old stuff behind, except your food, of course. Everyone likes your food, no matter where you're from. We always want to try the new food. But your other cultures, how you dress, how you worship, that language that's not English, we're not interested. So the focus in this era, KKK said their focus was just getting everyone to be American. Now, they're going to, and I mentioned this in the recording as well, but they're going to try to get more involved in politics during this era. So they want to control more public policy. And in the Midwest and the South, there's a lot of success there, to the point where there'll be a nominee for president in one party who was the Grand Wizard, the head of the KKK. And what ends up sort of destroying the reputation of the KKK, which is a funny thought, in the 1920s, is that guy, turns out that he was an alcoholic who violently abused a woman to the point where she died. So because he wasn't pro-American, pro-woman, in favor of prohibition in his own personal life, because behind the scenes he was very hypocritical, then people went, I guess the KKK is really not that great. And so they kind of declined for a while. And if, for whatever reason, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be, but I will tell you that if you attend a public high school, don't do your KKK research on your school laptop. That's going to cause some problems. But the KKK is big in about 3 periods in US history, one right after the Civil War, one during the time period we're studying, and then you'll see it again during the Civil Rights Movement. And then after that, I'm not saying there aren't people who are white supremacists. I'm saying the KKK as an organized group is not as viable as it used to be. There's a reason for that, by the way, moderately interesting, is somebody sues them and takes all their money. They were actually a corporation. And so somebody sued them and took all their money, and it destroyed the organization. So good job suing. That's really kind of fascinating to me and very American, I think. The Leo Frank fellow, you could read a book about that. It'd be depressing. This is an example of anti-Jewish, excuse me, catching my breath there, discrimination during this era. And, you know, a lot of that is because there are lots of immigrants who are Jewish and potentially agnostic as well, who come in during that era. And the stuff we talked about in the other class today, which is kind of where we'll start with a little more detail, is here. So let me stop for just a second before we go back to WEB, the NAACP, and Harlem Renaissance, and see if you guys have any questions or concerns. Might give me a chance to look at the roll again as well. Anybody want to ask anything? Anybody have a concern? You guys still with me? Okay. All right, so you're still there. I'm glad to hear that. And you have at least 2 or 3 spokespersons, so good job. Oh, somebody's asking when stuff's due. Yeah, quiz. I'm putting in the quiz today and tomorrow. It should show up unless I program it wrong, which I did for one class last time, so sorry, I can't remember if it was your class. Should show up at midnight on Wednesday, and then it will go away at midnight on Friday. Now, this quiz is a little longer. It has 20 questions. I'm still going to leave the time limit for an hour. If that doesn't work for you, I think the way that it's set up, and you know, if I'm wrong, I trust that you'll tell me. I think the way I've got it set up is that it'll tell you when the hour is up, but you can still keep going. So that way I'll know you took longer than an hour. I also know, I mean, because some of you sent me stuff, that some of you get more time. So, you know, I get that. I get that. So I kind of think an hour will be long enough, but, you know, I don't know. So you'll let me know, I trust. All right. So all that stuff should show up Wednesday, and all the questions are officially due Wednesday. I'm gonna try, because it just took so long to grade all that stuff. I don't know why I didn't think it would, because there were 300 responses that I had to grade, and it really did take like 2.5 weeks. So I will try to get a head start on the things you've already turned in, so that way maybe the feedback will come a little faster. So, all right. Any other questions or concerns? Yeah, questions are due on Friday. Yeah. Oh, do I have the wrong date? Is that what you're telling me? I can go back and correct that if you like, but try to turn stuff in on Friday. What is, I really do have the wrong date? Is that what you're telling me? I'll go back and look, but the goal is Friday. And, all right, okay, all right. Back to the notes then. All right, huh. I have weird things available on my notes there. Some picture of a canyon. All right, so during this time period, you see the formation of the NAACP. Now, this is also something you could find books about. N.W.E.B. Du Bois, also fairly prominent African-American leader, very prominent, that you could read about for your book review if you wanted to. But Du Bois is the first African-American to graduate with a PhD from Harvard. He had also studied economics at the University of Berlin, I believe it was. So he's an internationally traveled, highly intellectual fellow. He wrote a book you could read for the book review as well, which I think you might like. It's called The Souls of Black Folks. and it's a collection of essays, really his commentary on current events or issues of the time period when he lived. So moderately interesting, I think, and certainly brilliantly written. I think the title sounds a little folksy, of course, but the contents are not. But he's part of a group of progressive reformers who form a group called the Niagara Movement. And they're the ones who eventually form the NAACP. Niagara Movement is pushing for racial and ethnic equality, and they meet in Niagara, New York, which also borders Canada. And the reason they meet there is it's illegal. After Plessy versus Ferguson, segregation spreads throughout the country. So it's illegal to have an integrated meeting in New York. So, and in most states. So if they get caught, you know, if the police are coming to arrest them, what they do is they would just step over the border and have the rest of the meeting in Canada. Their goal is to push for ethnic and racial equality in the United States, and they form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. And I think that starts around 1905, but it's early. So it's well over 100 years old. When I taught high school, students would ask me, like, why don't they change the name? Because I would get on to the high school kids because, you know, they would say write inappropriate things, names for African Americans. They would call African Americans colored people. And I would tell them, you're not 100, you don't get to say that. And then they would say, well, what about the name? And I said, you know, no one calls it that. They just call it the NAACP because it's old and we just know it by its initials. So, but I think they keep the name because people know it, the name, and they don't really know what the initials stand for. At any rate, the goal of the organization is to push for racial and ethnic equality in the United States and for integration, and also pretty specifically during that era to get lynching outlawed, which we've talked about before was a little too common of a problem in certain areas of the country. The other thing the NAACP will do is they will have a legal action wing, and they will bring court cases on behalf of African Americans within the United States, people who have concerns about inequalities. And the big case that they will eventually bring is something called Brown versus Board of Education. And the goal of that case is to desegregate public schools. Now that takes about 25 to 30 years and really starts with desegregating law schools, which is kind of an interesting concept. But they make many, many trips to the Supreme Court to desegregate different levels of schools in the process of desegregating public schools. So there you go. And the NAACP also makes sure to publicize lynching and other inequalities during this time period to try to get a more public discussion of equal rights going. Du Bois is from New York. I think we've already mentioned he's a pretty highly educated fellow, unusually gifted, unusually academic, intellectual kind of fellow. He writes the first study of the demographics of urban poverty in a study of Philadelphia. And what else do I want to say about him? He pushes for a couple things. One, something called the talented 10th, the idea that the top part of the African American community, the most academic or financially able part, should establish businesses and foundations to pull up the rest of the African American community to make the entire community more successful. Sort of the rising tide floats all boats idea. And the other, what was the other thing I was going to say? Du Bois. Oh, that if you were being discriminated against, you know, rather than accepting that the way that maybe Booker T. Washington would say, like, don't worry about that, just push for economic equality. He said, heck no, worry about that, go to court. If somebody's discriminating against you, take them to court. You've got the 14th Amendment. It's time to stand up and demand your rights. So Du Bois, a little younger, a little more northern than Booker T. Washington, and you'll see him have a very different philosophy of how to fight to improve the African American community in the United States. So, all right, during this era, also something called the Harlem Renaissance, which we will talk about here for a few minutes. And my assumption is you have a vague familiarity with the Harlem Renaissance. Have you heard of it before? Harlem Renaissance, maybe? Maybe not? I don't know. You've heard of Harlem? Yeah, okay. So yay for the yes. Section in New York City, ethnic neighborhood in New York City, African American primarily. And during this era, it's really kind of a very separate African American culture from American culture, and African American cultural norms, writing, music, poetry, art, that kind of stuff wasn't accepted as part of mainstream American culture. So the goal of the Harlem Renaissance, the behind the scenes part of it, the NAACP contest part of it, was to make sure that African American artists and musicians would be recognized nationally and then internationally and be accepted as part of the mainstream culture of the United States. And in that way, I think this movement was very successful. Well, there were very few ways it wasn't successful. I'm not trying to suggest that it wasn't. So this is a movement in the 1920s to emphasize African American cultural contributions, especially in art, literature, and music. And the contests were monetary awards to writers and artists and musicians in the area who were willing to enter the contest. And this leads to prominence of new, well, not necessarily new, but leads to the prominence of musicians and artists like Countee Cullen, Louis Armstrong, Claude McKay, Bessie Smith, who for a while is the highest paid singer in the United States, not African American singer, but singer. Langston Hughes, who's a fairly famous African American poet, who's from my hometown, Joplin, Missouri, and also leads to the prominence of the Cotton Club. And the Cotton Club was a jazz nightclub that was really a big deal in Harlem. Now, before the Harlem Renaissance, it's primarily the neighbors went there. So African Americans attended, and it was the weekend hotspot for sure. After the Harlem Renaissance and the prominence of guys like Louis Armstrong and other musicians of the era, what you end up seeing is that people from other sections of New York City will travel to Harlem to visit the Cotton Club. Your book talks really specifically about this. And they use a term I probably wouldn't use, but was certainly used during this time period. But people are going to that neighborhood, which they traditionally would say, like, I would never live there, I wouldn't go there, it's dangerous, but they're definitely going there to hear the music. And what becomes kind of interesting about that is it leads to sort of segregated entertainment at the African American, primarily African American musician Cotton Club, Jazz Club. So there'll be nights where trendy New Yorkers who are white are going to go to the Cotton Club, and if you're in the neighborhood, you can't go. So it leads to segregation of the Cotton Club, which is kind of weird. Yeah. As far as if these guys are famous, Louis Armstrong, he's a very famous jazz trumpeter during the time period. If you've heard of him, it's because he sang a song called What a Wonderful World. And that's probably the most prominent thing that we've heard in our lifetimes. I know that it was really trendy when I was a kid and certainly was popular in the 50s and 60s still. County Cullen, I think, is that participatory poetry. So I don't know that we do that so much anymore, but it's kind of from that call and respond tradition of African American churches. So, or, you know, some of you are going like, no, I go to church like that too. And it's not, you know, kind of leads me to the thought that we still segregate lots of parts of our society. And I think sometimes church is a little more segregated than it should be. But African American church tradition, call and respond, is the preacher would say something, the congregants, the people in the audience would say something back, and they would talk back and forth. And not in the like Catholic mass kind of way. I mean, it was kind of loud and rowdy and, you know, maybe fun. I don't know. It would depend on how you viewed it, but very serious as well at the same time. So this developed, County Cullen developed a style of poetry that was like that. And Langston Hughes, since we're talking, poet who wrote primarily about inequality, difficulties of being poor, difficulties of not being in the mainstream, but did it through poetry, and really simple but kind of poignant poetry. I'm a huge fan in part because he's from my hometown, but also in part because the poetry is just really eloquent. You know, he doesn't use, it's not really wordy, but it's just really packed with meaning. So, but, you know, poetry is very individual. And I don't know, do you guys read poetry? Do you ever read poetry in your English classes? Does that happen? I want to know, seriously. Read poetry? Okay, all right. Because I just sort of thought you read occasionally a novel and usually essays, but I don't know. Poetry. I like poetry. All right. If you study the Harlem Renaissance, which you could read a book about that, free book review if you liked. I'm always trying to suggest stuff you might want to read. And that might be interesting. One of the things, I had a feminist history class. Have you guys ever had a feminist history class? I guess as you haven't at this level of your academic preparation. But feminist history classes are maybe not what you expect. Oh, one of you has. It's very exciting. And I've only had a couple, but one of them was a big study about prostitution. I've learned I am about the most conservative person, not necessarily politically, but in how I live my life. Like, I don't swear, I don't drink, there's a lot of stuff I don't do and feel guilty about, all kinds of stuff, you know, just from growing up in the Midwest, I think. But I know way more about prostitution than anyone should because I read books about prostitution in this feminist history class. One of the other things that I read, which was a little more comfortable for me to read, was about the difference in the male and female African American writers during the Harlem Renaissance, and how the work of the female writers was often suppressed by the work of the male writers in this movement, because the female writers tended to be Black Southern women who wrote about their family experiences. And a lot of times poor rural, whether it's Black, white, Hispanic, whatever, poor rural family experiences is rough. It is. And it's full of poverty, sometimes abusive situations. And the women wrote about their experiences, which often put African American men in kind of a bad light. Not all African American men, but certainly they were main characters in some of the literature. So the Black men who were more in charge of this era of this movement really kind of pressured publishers not to publish the writings of Black women of this era because they were seen as too negative toward Black men. And there was already enough negativity towards Black men, so this movement of African American culture during the era didn't want to emphasize that any more than it had already been emphasized. So moderately interesting stuff. But yeah, feminist history classes, I guess it depends on who's teaching them and what the description is, but you can learn some interesting things. And I always would tell my high school students, like, if you're a guy and you're thinking that's a good place to meet women, you're misjudging the purpose of that class. Just trust me on this. Trust me. All right. But the Harlem Renaissance, I think, is fairly successful. It's more than fairly, it's very successful at ushering in an era where African American culture just becomes mainstream as part of American culture. So it's not really seen as separate and leads to different influences, especially in music, which is not a huge shock to you. I'm trying to think too, there's some boxer during this time period. I think his name is Johnson. Maybe, I can't remember if it's John Johnson. It's somebody Johnson. Do any of you follow boxing? Um, I'm not super interested in boxing because people hitting each other's, I can't look at it because I'm just weak like that. But there was a boxer whose last name was Johnson during this time period who was heavyweight champion of the world briefly and lived a very African-American guy who lived a very unapologetically integrated lifestyle. He had white girlfriends. He was pretty wild and urban and that kind of stuff. And um, he was kind of an interesting factor, like cultural factor. It wasn't Johansson, Jack Johnson. That's who it was. Thank you. Yeah, but I believe that there probably was this guy named Johansson who was a boxer during this era. But you will also see a real cultural backlash to this Jack Johnson fellow as well. And I know there are books written about that. And there was a PBS series called, I think it was just called Unapologetically Black. It was about him. So this is a really interesting time period where you see lots of people kind of pushing limits, the cultural limits that have been established, but in the middle of prohibition and this really unregulated economy. So people felt like, well, if we can change the economy and we can maybe end poverty, which we clearly didn't, maybe it's time that we can end other stereotypes and limits. And it wasn't. It wasn't at all. But you do, I mean, you do see the beginnings of change, maybe, but they're going to be pushed back. So the hint that there could be change, maybe, but still a lot of pushback during this era. But there's a ton of interesting stuff you could read about. If you like literature during this era, excuse me for a second. Sorry, I think it would be hard for you to read a novel for our book review. I think that's a bad idea. Just because you'd have to talk really specifically about the accuracy of the setting and less about the characters. And if you read a novel, you always want to write about the characters. I know that's how that works. But I think you could write about novelists during this time period, that group of writers who were part of the Harlem Renaissance. You could write about, oh, who's that guy? He and his wife are, Fitzgerald, who wrote Gatsby, and his wife, is it Zelda? Yeah, F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. They're part of a group called the Lost Generation of writers, and most of them end up being expatriates, end up moving out of the country because they're so disappointed about how ineffective the progressive movement was. But this is an interesting era for literature as well, and there'll be, who was it that wrote The Company Man? I can't think of, Eliot? Somebody last, yeah. But there's a lot of the writers who talk during this time period about how the average American really just wants to get ahead economically, get a nice house, buy a Ford, you know, just get established, have their family, and that their world is so small that they really don't notice important things, changes or not changes going on around them. So there's a lot of literature that's critical of just the average cultural movements during this time period. And if you read, you know, you could read about one of those writers during that time period, but also sports are kind of interesting during this era. I think this is the end of the Ty Cobb and beginning of the Babe Ruth era. And you could talk about cultural influences of, you could read about cultural influence of baseball, how there's a lack of integration of baseball during this time period. I read just an article one time about how the major leagues of baseball decided for a few years they would have sort of a championship series with the Negro leagues of baseball. And that didn't last for more than a couple of years, and I'll let you guess why. But You know, an interesting thought about I mean, there's just a lot of interesting cultural things, and almost anything you would want to read about, you can relate to the politics and economics of the time. So, you know, if you want to read about music in the 20s and 30s, if you want to read about sports in the 20s and 30s, I think a Jack Johnson book would be interesting and historically relevant. But there's also just straight history books that would be, if you read about the Scopes monkey trial, that would be good. If you read about Clarence Darrow, the famous lawyer of the time period, Harlem Renaissance in general, there's NAACP, Leo Frank, there's a ton of stuff. Yeah. All right. I'm going to stop for just a second, and then we'll talk about causes of the Great Depression, because I know that's the main reason you came. Weekly question. Let's see if you have any questions, and give me a chance to take a drink again. Coke Zero today, by the way. It was water earlier. Because we're studying Prohibition, no alcohol. So I guess when Prohibition ends, 1933, I'll start drinking during class. You have that on record. All right, so you're not asking questions. So let's look at causes of the Great Depression. Okay, now I'm just going to tell you again, the best place for you to look for this is the end of chapter 20. Those last few pages. My arm is still a little flaky, so hopefully I won't drop the book. Yeah, it might be the medicine talking. Now I have this weird little, I don't know if you can see it, the weird little IV in my neck. Some weird stuff after the surgery. Weird when you get to carry around your drugs for 3 or 4 days. All right. What? I have volume 1 instead of volume 2? My goodness. But at the very end, it is the surgery talking now. Hang on 1 second. Looks back here. Where you hide stuff. It's crazy. All right. So let me find page numbers for you. But it's the very end of chapter 20, where it talks really, really specifically about how things kind of fell apart. And then the beginning of the next chapter. Okay. So if you look at, oh, it's perfect, page 810 with the heading, The Great Depression. And then there's a section called The Coming of the Great Depression. And then Americans in the Great Depression. And then Hoover's response to the Great Depression. So the end of this chapter is just lays it out for you. It's going to be so simple. You're going to be so happy. It'll be good. Okay, way better than, say, shoulder surgery. I'm just saying. Okay. So end of chapter 20, starting with the section where it says the Great Depression. But I'll kind of refer you to, for whatever reason, when I made the notes, I put most of those notes, in with chapter 21. Excuse me, because I just thought it fit better, but I don't know what I was thinking. So let me share the notes again. We'll go back to that. So, problems with the Great Depression, or how it started. So, stock market crash, you definitely want to talk about the stock market crash for sure. And I guess I didn't really talk a whole lot about the causes of the Great Depression. Let me scroll down, make sure. Nope, not really. Okay. All right. Then we'll just talk. Problems with the economy, what leads to the Great Depression. Now, the economy had been growing pretty rapidly, and there was a lot of government support. Sorry, I'm scrolling up to see if there was anything that I wrote in here that would be helpful, but I don't think there was. Well, just that little part. So, anything related to the automobile industry is going well. Anything related to the not automobile industry is not going well. So food and textile, agricultural stuff. And the markets that we created during World War I for the agricultural sector really dry up during this time period. Also, federal government is not regulating the economy in any way. So while this sounds potentially good to, libertarian sorts of thinking people, it also means that stuff we hadn't thought about before, which should be illegal, people are doing, like, let's talk about some things. I don't know that you need to look at the notes anymore because there's nothing in there, is there? So stuff like borrowing money to buy stocks and buying stock on the margin. So these are ideas that you don't have to have the cash in hand to buy the stocks that you want. So people could borrow up to 90% of the value of the stock if they wanted to buy stock. So, and they could do that with loans that didn't require collateral. And collateral, I don't know if you're familiar with this, you probably are if you've had to take out loans. Collateral is stuff that you have that the bank can take away from you if you don't pay for your loan. So like I have a super fancy house, with my teaching salary. And if I wanted to make improvements on my super fancy house, I could get a home improvement loan. And then my home would be the collateral for that loan. So if I decided not to make those payments, then the bank would come and take my house, which might be rude, but I had pledged it as security for my loan. I think you see this more often with people pledging their car, like a title loan, that sort of thing. Or you have a co-signer on a loan, that sort of thing. Somebody who agrees to pay the loan if you can't afford it. And if you're a younger person, sometimes you have to have those on certain loans. But during this time period, they didn't require any of those things. So people were buying stock with loans and they didn't have any collateral or co-signers. So if you don't have collateral or a co-signer and you get a loan, sometimes you're a little reckless. And that's sort of what we saw during this time period. And because so many people were participating, not a majority of people, but just a handful of really reckless people were participating in the stock market, it drove up the values of stock, which drove up the prices of stock. But the stock wasn't really worth as much as people were paying for it. So they were inflated stock values, what I'm trying to say, because there was so much demand for stock. And the inflation was also in part because people were able to buy the stocks with unsecured loans. You could also borrow against the value of your stock portfolio without actually selling your stock portfolio to buy more stocks. So it made people really reckless with their money. Most people, however, did not buy stocks. Most people did, however, have money in banks. And those banks were the entities that loaned money to the crazy people who bought stock, the reckless people. So when the reckless people could not pay back their loans, the money that the banks had loaned was actually from your paycheck that you had just deposited in the bank. So then you lost your paycheck because the bank loaned money to some reckless dude who bought stock. So bank collapses and stock market problems were an issue. Your book talks more specifically about that and will probably be more helpful than I just was, but that's kind of the general idea. Now, the stock market crash is not the only reason for the Great Depression, but it is a big problem in the United States. There are global economic problems as well. So, global issues, excuse me. International trade was starting to be more limited. People, not necessarily that you couldn't trade internationally, but that as the economy starts to decline, people are adding tariffs, which increases the prices of imported and exported goods. And if, like, we put a tariff on German goods, then Germany would put a tariff on US goods. So that way it limited international markets. Also, you may have heard, World War I, or the Great War, was expensive. At the end of World War I in the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty assessed a war guilt or reparation, a payment to Germany, which would go to France and England, primarily France and England, some to Belgium and other places, but of $33 billion. Germany did not have the money to pay this. In addition, the treaty also took away certain regions of Germany, either permanently or temporarily, loaned to them to France, so that France could reap the benefits of that economic or economic region or region of natural resources. So they took away the German ability to make a certain amount of money and then assessed a really large war debt to them. Now, I'm not suggesting we should all feel sorry for Germany. I have no idea. I do have an idea, but the thought is that maybe this was an inappropriate punishment for war. So it ends up bankrupting Germany. Germany can't pay their money to England and France. England and France can't pay the money they owe to the United States. The United States decides to refinance the German reparations, the German war debt, so that they can repay France and England, so France and England can repay the United States. And all of that kind of falls through as well. So you have some international finance issues, plus the collapse of the German economy, which was a very large European economy. So that's going to be a problem. And you know what happens because of the collapse of the German economy, that has some consequences that go far beyond the economic consequences for sure. Also, there's an issue, I'm still talking, aren't I? There's a lot of issues. There's an issue of overproduction. So we really didn't control inventories of manufactured goods during this time period very well. They weren't, there wasn't an electronic, point of sale inventory system where when you sell a certain number, it directs somebody to order a certain number of products so that things are consistently resupplied. So manufacturers just kind of guessed, and they didn't really reassess their inventories based on current sales. So companies made too much stuff, is what I'm trying to say. So by the time they notice they've made too much stuff, they've got all these inventories and they go like, crap, we've made too much stuff. Nobody's buying stuff, so we're gonna have to lay people off. Now, about the time the German economy collapses is about the time that there's a stock market crash, which of course leads to the bank failures and also leads to companies going like, we already have large inventory, so we gotta lay people off. So all of those things happen at the same time. If you want to be kind of a smart aleck, you could argue that prohibition caused the Great Depression, but I don't think that works. I don't think that works, but you could try. So the question again, weekly question, you read it. Describe the causes of the Great Depression, be specific and detailed. And then there's a part of it that says what laws or absence of laws might have set the conditions for this event. So when you talk about that section, that's probably a good part where you could talk about how they could regulate bank loans, how you needed collateral to make certain loans, or stock trades, how you shouldn't allow people to borrow money to finance their stock purchases. How there's really, I think you could talk about the war debt, how maybe it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to assess a very large debt to a single country in a war. There was discussion of that as well. But anything that regulates business during this time period and how financial business especially is conducted might have been helpful, maybe. And then there's another section, yay for lots of sections, where it says what were the government responses to the Depression before 32. And that's the section in the book where you'll read about Herbert Hoover. So the Herbert Hoover section, I'll go back to the notes just for a second. Back to notes. Scrolling down. A couple of things are created during Herbert Hoover's presidency, and there are these two things. Well, I think this is one of them. You can talk about this if you want. Smoot-Hawley tariff, which is going to raise import duties on imported goods, which will cause other countries to do the same thing to us. Although, truthfully, honestly, I don't know that it would have made a difference because at that point we're all broke, but who knows? And let me try again. Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It's tough when you can't highlight, isn't it? So Smoot-Hawley tariff, which your book will talk about a little, but Reconstruction Finance Corporation and Federal Farm Bureau, these two things kind of do the same thing, but for different industries. Let me try again. Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It's essentially a bank for large businesses, and you could borrow. It's sort of like the oh gosh, the recent things that the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Act that you've seen recently. There's supposed to be government programs for businesses to help continue to pay their workers. That was the idea behind these. So Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a loan that you could apply for, and the goal was that you wouldn't fire your employees. You would keep them on the payroll. What companies typically did is they would borrow the money and then buy their own stock to shore up their own company, or they would keep on their executives but fire their employees, or pay off their stock options, that sort of thing. Federal Farm Bureau was a loan program for landowners who were farmers, and they could get money to continue to work their farms. But this only benefited you if you were a farmer who actually owned land. And you've already read enough about this era, or even before this era, to know that there were a handful of farmers who owned land. Most of the people who farmed land farmed somebody else's land. They were sharecroppers. So none of these programs helped those guys at all. So Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Federal Farm Bureau were supposed to help people keep their employees on either businesses or large farms, and that's not how those programs worked out. Also, Herbert Hoover created a few public works programs, and the main one of those was creation of a very large dam, Northern California, Southern Nevada, called now the Hoover Dam. And if you ever lived out in that area, or your parents said, hey, we'll have a fun family vacation, we'll go to Las Vegas. Now, I don't know that that's a fun family vacation, but there are like 3 things the kids can do. And one of them is take a tour of Hoover Dam. So you may have seen that because your parents had to do something with you. And most of the things they were doing in Las Vegas, you couldn't do. So the Hoover Dam is a hugely important public works project. However, it does not get the entire country back to work, and it doesn't solve the Great Depression. Now, Herbert Hoover is going to do more specifically to try to improve the economy than any other president had done before. But if you compare what he does to FDR, it's going to come up lacking. It's not going to look like enough. But Herbert Hoover's concern was that if you give too much public assistance to individuals, that they will become lazy and dependent on the government. So you don't want to give them like direct aid, money, food, that kind of stuff, because then they won't want to go to work. You hear similar discussions even to this day. Like you probably could even hear that actual discussion today if you wanted to hear it. The difference, I think, then and now, although then I think it's a little more similar than we like, then and now are a little more similar than we like. During that era, all of the jobs really had disappeared. There were no jobs. It wasn't like, I'm not taking that job at McDonald's because I went to college and I'm not going to work at McDonald's. It wasn't that you wouldn't take a job that was beneath you. There were no jobs to take in that era. So I think now, I don't know, you guys probably have a different assessment of this, but I think now, especially in an area like Austin, sometimes it's just there's not a job that fits your qualifications. You might be able to find a job, but it would be a terrible job, or you'd make like $8 or $9 an hour, and your thought is I'd really like to make 15 or 20. But you could find a job, it just wouldn't be a good one. In that era, you couldn't even find a bad job. So I think Hoover really saw the economy in very traditional terms. Almost everyone did, except John Maynard Keynes, who we'll talk about next time, who was an English economist who saw it slightly differently. But almost everybody thought, well, the economy will just fix itself. So we don't want to intervene too much because we don't want to mess up the business cycle or the economic cycle. But in this instance, they probably needed to interrupt the business cycle. All right, I feel like I'm done talking for a variety of reasons. Mostly, I don't want to talk anymore. Excuse me. But let me see if you have questions. I would happily answer them, even though I just said I didn't want to talk. I would happily answer a question. So, causes of Great Depression, very end of chapter 20, will give you all the stuff you need to hear or read, and just make sure that you answer all the little parts of the question. So, some causes, describe them a little bit, suggest some laws that maybe could have been there that would have helped. And then what does the government do? That's Hoover. What do you do during the Hoover administration that helps, and did it help very much? Okay. All right. Don't leave just yet because I want to double check the roll, but do you guys have any, can I repeat? Why are you making me repeat? No, I told you I would. Wednesday, like 12:01, if I programmed it right. I'll go back and check, but Wednesday is when the quiz opens, and then it closes Friday. And if you forget any of that, I promise you it's in the syllabus as well. I'm near that little calendar section where it says stuff is due. But you can keep asking, I don't mind at all. All right, I'm gonna double check the roll while you guys ask questions, maybe. Seemed like when I was looking, there was nobody with the last name of A here. I think Raul fixed that for us. All right, so I didn't see Morgan or Victoria. And then the next person I didn't see is Isaiah or Mitchell. So let's see. Isaiah, Mitchell. Okay. Yeah, I got you. I really did get you this time, Raul. I got you. I know I leave you out sometimes. And then next person I didn't see was, let's see. Oh, I don't even want to say out loud because I've missed this person before. Marco. I'm looking now. And next person I don't see is Eric. I think he's the person who's never come. Josh Contreras. I see you. You can say something, but I see you. And then Miracle Curry. I don't see. Then Colton Kincaid. I'm looking. Yep, I see you. And next person I didn't see was Cynthia Palomo. But I see you now. But you can still say something. And I think that's it. All right. So stay behind and ask questions. If you're concerned that I didn't get you on the roll, you can ask me. And I think that's it for today because I'm just really tired. But I don't know how you can get tired of history. All right, you guys have a lovely day. Stay behind and ask questions if you like. Thank you all for coming. I hope you have a good day as well. Take care of yourselves. Have a nice weekend. Get some rest. Wear a mask. I don't know. Don't have shoulder surgery. It's not worth it. Okay, oh crud. I'm still recording, aren't I?